Welcome to today's Global Conversations, and this event is co-sponsored by UCI's Shakespeare Center. And this is a series called Global Conversations. I started this series during the pandemic and trying to connect the greatest artists and scholars around the world without worrying about getting them a visa and without worrying about creating terrible carbon footprints. So our topic today is Asian theater, Asian Shakespeare. So we know who Shakespeare was, but do we know who Shakespeare is? And after this hour, you will know that part of Shakespeare's identity today depends on who's doing Shakespeare and how, why, and where Shakespeare is happening. So I have the greatest pleasure today to have two distinguished speakers and two of my greatest colleagues to serve as moderators. And I will first introduce the speakers and guide the presentation. And after, about 45 minutes, and then I will introduce the moderators, and then they will lead the Q&A session. So our first speaker is Dr. Beatrice Lei. She's the founding chair of the Asian Shakespeare Association, that is ASA. She received her Ph.D. in English from New York University and has published on Sidney, Shakespeare, early modern culture, intercultural theater, films, television, and popular culture. Dr. Lei is founding director of the Taiwan Shakespeare Database, and that is an open access online performance archive hosted by the National Taiwan University. And she's also a co-editor of the Arden series Global Shakespeare Inverted. She taught at National Tsinghua University and National Taiwan University, and currently serves as a vice chair of the International Shakespeare Association, which is ISA, and she is also assistant director of the Shakespeare Association of America, which is SAA. So you can see that Dr. Lei is a top leader of many world Shakespeare organizations. And Dr. Lei today is speaking from the San Francisco Bay Area. And our second speaker is Dr. Judy Celine, and she's a professor and chair of the Department of English and Comparative Literature at the University of the Philippines, Diliman. She was a Fulbright scholar and at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, and Asia Fellow and visiting research scholar at the University of Malaya. She is a founding member and vice chair of the Asian Shakespeare Association. And Dr. Eek is an author of Unsex Me Here, Female Power and Shakespearean Tragedy. And she's also the author of many articles on Shakespeare, performance, and colonial education in the Philippines. As author, actor, and dramaturg, she has worked with several academic and professional theater companies in the Philippines and around Asia. And Dr. Eek today is speaking from Manila, about 7,000 miles away from UC Irvine. So welcome, Dr. Lei and Dr. Eek. So I'm going to start with a very simple question. So since we're talking about Asian Shakespeare, so what is Asia and what is Asian Shakespeare?
Okay, should I start? So yeah, I think Asian Shakespeare, there are two subjects. And as Daphne said, we know who Shakespeare was, at least, right? But what is Asia? So Asia actually is huge. Asia has 1/3 of the land mass on the world and 60% of the population. But Asia is not an isolated piece of land like Africa or North America, right? Asia, the border between Asia and Europe is actually artificial. and arbitrary and contested even, right? Like, for example, Russia, right? Is that Europe or Asia? Or Turkey, who is trying to join the EU. It's part of NATO, but not EU, right? And as we know that Israel plays their soccer in a European league. Right? So what exactly is Asia is very problematic. It's actually the concept of Asia is a European invention, right? From the Europeans in early modern time, they're like, Asia is like not us. Asia is, what we are not. And therefore, we have later the concept of Near East and Middle East and Far East, right? East to whom? To what, right? For people like us from Taiwan or Japan, we are from the Far East, right? East to what, right? So Asia is a very Eurocentric notion. It's an artificial invention. But for people here in Asia, like a few hundred years ago or a few thousands years ago, like people in current Japan or India never thought there was anything in between, right? They were two separate peoples, right? Not like part of Asia, something bigger. So that's why, when we talk about Asia, we know that it consists of like multiple races, ethnicities, religions, languages, cultures, economies. There's first world Asia, third world Asia, right? And histories, including colonial history. So that's why I think Asian Shakespeare is so interesting, right? And then Judy has a theory of the archipelago Asia. So maybe she can elaborate on that.
Yeah, Judy, yeah.
Yeah, hi. Good morning. Oh no, good afternoon for you. Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you to UCI and USwan. Unlike Beatrice, I'm in a time zone where it's not quite 10 in the morning. So I actually wrote down what I have to say in the answer to Daphne's questions, and I have some slides. So if Mia can just put up my slides, please. There you go. Okay, and I just want to answer that question of Asian Shakespeare and what is Asia. The label Asian Shakespeare is, as Beatrice says, an inherently fraught and almost impossible term. After all, how does one even begin to lump more than half of the world's population, its major religions and ideologies, and some of the richest and poorest global economies under the singular assignation Asia? And then to append that to the ever indeterminate category called Shakespeare, for truly what constitutes Shakespeare or Shakespeare's anyway, seems a hopeless task indeed. And yet here we are. We labor in the hope that there must be some value to yoking these two huge terms together. It must be asked, why? What do we gain when we begin to see Shakespeare through Asian lenses? To gesture towards an answer to this question, I can only speak of my own experience of Asian Shakespeare and when it became a thing for me. Although I had lived in the Philippines, in Asia for most of my life, studied and later taught and worked on Shakespearean productions here, I wasn't always an Asian Shakespearean or even aware of Shakespeare outside of just Shakespeare. My professors at university simply taught me Shakespeare without any connection to who or where I was. The same is true for when I pursued graduate studies in the US. I studied Shakespeare, but never with reference to my being Filipino or Asian. I just did Shakespeare. That began to change, however, some 2 decades ago, when I was invited to a small conference at the National University of Singapore called Shakespeare Performance in the New Asia. I must admit I was rather agog and wide-eyed throughout the conference, for never before had I thought about Shakespeare and Asia in the same mental space. Can you have the next slide, please? At this conference, I discovered two kinds or frames of looking at Shakespeare in Asia. For lack of better labels, I'm sorry, there was a previous slide. But anyway, for lack of better labels, I'll refer to them as the post-colonial version, one which I knew well because Shakespeare's history in the Philippines was at least partially a history of colonial imposition by the Americans, not the British, and two, intercultural Shakespeare, or Shakespeare from those Asian cultures so unfettered by his language or origins, which led to the most liberating interpretations on stage or in popular culture. Recasting Shakespearean plays as Beijing opera or no dramas was quite unknown to me then and blew my mind. Unbothered by fidelity, consumed by non-English speaking publics, which necessitated linguistic and cultural translations, and with a confidence bolstered by even more ancient, well-established theatrical forms, Shakespeare performances from Asia of the intercultural variety estranged Shakespeare and threw the plays into a newfound relief for me. I knew then that the comparative approach within Asia was warranted. Admittedly, quite ignorant about Asia, Shakespeare became the language through which I discovered and continue to discover Asia. Let me just cite some examples of the affordances or spaces opened up by looking at Shakespeare through Asia. And next slide, please. One is language and translation. I find that studying Asian Shakespeare is really rich because you always have to, most of the time, have to look at it through the lenses of language and translation. In most of Asia, Shakespearean performances involve translation, and often issues of untranslatability become a potent source of insights into both Shakespeare and Asian cultures. For example, in the Philippines, we had the hardest time trying to translate Richard III because there was no equivalent to the winter of our discontent in the tropics. The multilingualism of many sites' performance also allows more playful productions and expands linguistic possibilities of the Shakespearean text. We're not confined to only English. Another way, second, the richness and varieties of performance traditions in Asia that employ theatrical cross-dressing. You have single-sex companies, you have androgynous costuming, you have cross-dress roles, can raise many next-level questions about the role of gender and in performance. These practices complicate our understanding of performativity and gender long before Judith Butler pointed them out, introducing nuances beyond straightforward binarisms. Next to some Asian theater forms, Shakespeare's boy actors are amateur hour. And the third space, the other worlds of Asian Shakespeare. These are the spaces afforded by cultural practices like shamanism and the inclusion of the supernatural in theater or theater forms like No, where stories continue into an afterlife or one that is present simultaneously on stage. These upset the limited time and space horizons of realist Western theater. In many traditional forms of Asian theater, gods and ghosts are in on the action. The cosmography of some Asian theater forms, where the afterlife figures prominently, opens up Shakespeare to textual afterlives and alternative worldviews, where to be or not to be is no longer even a question because the characters have all become ghosts. The expanded worlds and the liberties taken by Shakespeare as produced in some parts of Asia was mind-blowing for me, a Filipino who is both blessed and cursed by English. The ability to read and perform in Shakespeare's language, which I initially viewed as an advantage, was in fact the very reason that Philippine Shakespeare feels or felt rather different, even limited, compared to Shakespearean productions from other parts of Asia. Like I've said, Shakespeare became the language through which I discovered Asia. At the same time, looking at Shakespeare again through the lenses of Asia exploded all my preconceived notions of Shakespeare's possibilities. Studying Shakespeare in, from, and by Asia, I decided was important, exciting, and a meaningful way of taking Shakespeare home and making Shakespeare take off his shoes before entering our homes, of course. I'll stop there.
Great. Wow, so it's actually not that simple, right? Asia
No.
or Asian Shakespeare. Okay, let's zoom in a little bit. So I know, Judy, you're based in the Philippines, and Beatrice, you're from Taiwan and has done a lot of work there as well. Let's focus on these two regions and talk about the Shakespeare in the Philippines and the Shakespeare in Taiwan.
Okay, so I will start with Taiwan. I think the blessing or curse of some other parts of Asia is that they don't speak English, unlike the Philippines, right? So there are basically two Asias in terms of Asian Shakespeare. One is those who speak English and those who don't, right? So my experience is like in Singapore, for example, they're still using the Cambridge A system, the curriculum. So all high school students need to read at least one Shakespeare, and then they do a different play every year. So what happens is like all the theater groups are like really eager to find out what will be the play next year. And then they will all put on the same play because that's what sells. The students and the teachers will bring the whole school to watch the play. So it's still very fixed. It's a very important part of their English curriculum in English-speaking Asia. And so when I took my students to Hong Kong, they have a university Shakespeare festival. And what happens is that they ask us to do only Shakespeare, no addition. You can cut because it's a 20 minutes performance. So you have to cut, but you can move things around, but you cannot add a single word. It has to be the authentic Shakespeare. And then you submit that script, 20-minute script. And then they hire native speakers to produce a CD. It was many years ago, so it was still in the CD form, a CD of accurate pronunciation. So what happens is they give you a CD of your script, which says to be or not to be, right? So the emphasis is on the accuracy of the language, right? Our actors obviously cannot say that line on the stage in that speed with that kind of, no emotion, no acting. But that's what they think is the most important thing when they have university students doing Shakespeare. But where I come from, the other part of Asia, where English, is a required subject in school, but even after many years of studying, most people don't speak much English. Then it's a different world because most people haven't read Shakespeare in the original or in translation. So for them, Shakespeare is what they learn from the stage or screen or a computer game or television or manga even. So they feel free to do whatever they want and to say whatever they want through Shakespeare. The adaptation is a lot more liberal and I think sometimes more fun. So I prepare a few clips for you. Originally in Taiwan, Shakespeare was at first produced like straight as part of the school system. People do it in English or in translation, but it was a tool to learn English and to learn the theater. But after in the late 1970s, after Chiang Kai-shek died, the society started to open up and then creativity boomed. So we had more interesting productions. So can I have my first video, which is by Contemporary Legend Theater in the 1986, in 1980, when they produced their first Shakespeare. This is a review of their several Shakespeares. Okay. So Wu Hsing-kuo, who is the founder of the Contemporary Legend Theater, 38 years ago, his original goal was just to revitalize Jingju, or Peking opera, which is like was losing its young audience. So he thought, we need to bring in something new to make it, more contemporary. And then so he summoned Shakespeare. So that was his goal. He did not think about overseas market or other stuff. But then it became so successful with their first adaptation of Macbeth. And once he blazed the trail, everything became possible. After him, you could see all kinds of Shakespeare. So today, there are straight or authentic, or Shakespeare, the traditional Shakespeare. There's also experimental and avant-garde little theater Shakespeare. There is popular musical Shakespeare, large scale, full scale musicals. There's also children's Shakespeare or animation. And of course, parody or spin-offs of Shakespeare. So I prepared, there's just, I don't even know where to start because there's so many. So I prepared a few examples for you to see the diversity of Taiwan Shakespeare today. We only had, no more than 40 years of liberal Shakespeare. But then see, we already have so much to offer. So let's take a look at the second video, which is, you can start, which is an interaction between real person and puppy theater, using both Chinese opera and puppy theater. Maybe we can stop here. Yeah, because we want to make sure that we have enough time for discussion. So Judy mentioned that cross-dressing, right, which is it's a tradition in Chinese theater. So we have some modern cross-dressing as well. As I said, there's Asian Shakespeare catered to young audience. So let's take a quick look at video 3, which is a film, and then it's all female, As You Like It. We know that As You Like It is already, cross-dressing is a big topic in it, and then here we have an all female As You Like It.
我爱上了一个人，他叫 Rose， 我想告诉他我爱他。我们找他好几天了，我想知道他在哪里。
脱离处男，
你才处男
你只要忘了那个劈腿的后面，就可以找到好老公了。
如果我变男生，会有人喜欢我吗？
你是罗斯福吧？
我们男人啊，都是用下半身思考的。你是用这里爱他，还是那里爱他？
我是真的爱他。
你爱他什么？
他眼睛，他眼睛跟他超像了。味道也跟他超像的。我喜欢女的。
All right, so let's move on. Yeah, let's move on. So this, as you can see, it's a beautiful young cast, and it's a popular film. And then, as I said, musicals are really big in Taiwan. And then here is then a Midsummer Night's Dream, and then it's called A Midsummer Night's Erotic Dream. So they said that the wood is not the woods, but it's a nightclub, so where people can party, and then therefore it is transformed into like a carnival, and it's a drag party. So it's very erotic. Let's take a look at video 4.
为了你，我什么都不管，爱上眼前这个男人，我的心从此不再飘荡，这犹豫让我硬邦邦。看着你，我什么都不管。你给我杠杠的，阿弟，你有种来单挑。阿弟，我就跟你说没有什么事，再给他干，不再狗丢了阿爸，下了夜我才会爱上你呀。 我的天，真是傻爆耶！你干嘛要挖你的塔？王八蛋啊！我的天，真是傻爆耶！比爱的才是你啊！我打死他跟你讲！好了，不要再闹了！我才真的不想再看到你那整形过的脸，可以吗？我没有，你有哎，没有了！我才不屌他！傻逼呀！看看你变毛多可爱！ 我想试试你的喉咙有多厉害，一整晚把你放起来。我的爱如潮水。
So yeah, you get the idea. And then this is a show that has run multiple times. It was very popular, and like my students, college students, really love it. It's like in your face sacrilege to some Shakespeareans, but we don't care. And what I personally feel like Chinese opera as a media for Shakespeare is not. When people think about Chinese opera, they think like it's very formalistic. It's like formal and cultured. But for me, I find the music to be really like a great vehicle to carry emotions, passions. And I think it probably does an even better job than Shakespearean language, than Shakespearean English. So that's why I think, Chinese opera Shakespeare, it can really be very intense and very dramatical. So we are working on a production of Julius Caesar, and which I think is approximates like total theater, because it's philosophical, poetical, political, musical, and physical. And also it's a world theater. It combines East, West, ancient, modern, and it's an immersive theater experience. So let's play the 5th and last video clip.
穿越过万里，日出东方，凌驾云浪。救命啊！
that's about Taiwan. Well, we can
Thank you. Yeah.
continue. Yeah, later. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much, Beatrice. And let's cross the strait and go to Philippines.
Okay, thank you. Mia, can you start with slide 5, please? Um, I won't show clips. I'll just show photos so it'll go faster. Hopefully we have more time. Right. Basically in the Philippines, if you look at the history of Shakespeare, you'll really see the history of two traditions that start right about at the same time, although there is evidence of Spanish translations into local languages late in the 19th century. The real sort of arrival date for Shakespeare would be the early 20th, except that it comes via two streams. First is Shakespeare is a colonial imposition. It was brought by the Americans when they colonized the Philippines, set up a school system in English for which Shakespeare was a big part. So starting in 1904, all Filipinos were required to read Shakespeare in English, and that continues to this day. But alongside that, you'd find local translations in local languages, usually from Spanish sources, later on from English sources once people learned English. And this sort of local vernacular translations were a little freer, took more liberties with the text, and this kind of also evolved into popular cultural sort of versions like film, television, comics. So these are the two strains. And you'll find that these two strains sort of resonate in the contemporary theater scene in Philippine Shakespeare. Now I have the next slide, please. Okay. What follows is really just sort of a cursory survey of the kinds of productions we have that sort of show you also how these two different traditions of Shakespeare have evolved in the Philippines. The first two examples show how the pedagogical imperative remains, and as such, Shakespeare is often staged to appeal to youth culture because people study him in school. Theater companies create these productions that appeal to the youth. This one is a production. How to read that, I've been told, is #our broken heart J, which you can guess is an adaptation of Romeo and Juliet. I don't know if you see the photo at the top. This is the famous balcony scene where a screen in the back is also having Romeo and Juliet texting even while they're doing the balcony scene. So it's all very Gen Z that way. Next slide, please. This one is one of the more popular things that has been restaged over 200, I think 300 times already all around the Philippines. It's not Shakespeare per se, but it's a play called William. And it is a rap musical about high school students fulfilling a Shakespearean class project while working out their own life problems through the performance and study of Shakespearean texts. This is more like an episode of Glee and High School Musical meeting Shakespearean drama. And it's toured all over the Philippines. I think a lot of high school teachers like showing this. Maybe we can play the short clip just to give you a flavor of what this is. Why do you read and study Shakespeare?
He hath disgraced me and hindered me $500,000. What's in the name? What's in the name?
Okay, I think you can stop now, Mia. Thank you. That just gives you a sense of what the production was like. Okay. My next examples illustrate, next slide, please, how performances have been globalized, or how the interculturalness of Shakespeare has expanded to involve not only its source culture in Shakespeare's England, or its, the source culture and then a local performance tradition, but has opened up to other traditions from around the world. In the past, plays were exclusively performed in some semblance of Elizabethan costumes, wearing ruffs and tights in the tropics. I never got that. In some gesture towards authenticity. Barring that, or if the production budgets were tight, they resorted to modern dress, or what I call black turtleneck Shakespeare. I participated in some productions like this when I was younger. We had no costume budget, so everybody just wear black turtlenecks and we'll be fine. Today, however, we find that even if staging full text and faithful translations of Shakespeare, design inspirations have drawn from other cultures outside the Elizabethan or strictly English period costumes. So, for example, here you see a double language production of King Lear, and you'll find that they're wearing outfits of royalty, but they're from the Cambodian court, no longer sort of strictly English. Next slide, please. This one, this next production is another version of King Lear, but it's sort of set in some post-apocalyptic Japanese samurai. So it's like King Lear meets Throne of Blood kind of design. So again, it's veering away from trying to represent an authentic English source. The next slide, this shows you a play called Sintang Dalisay, which is based on both Shakespeare and a local vernacular translation of Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet that is performed using the dance form of the Igal, which is a dance form shared by the Samabajau people of maritime Southeast Asia. So it's not exclusively Philippine. It's a cultural tradition that exists in the southern Philippines, but it is as exotic to us in Manila as it would be for other people outside the maritime Southeast Asia. It's a cultural form that is shared between Indonesia, Malaysia, and Philippines. So while it's a Shakespearean play from the Philippines using a Philippine text or Philippine texts, it also uses a dance grammar that is shared, not necessarily global, but certainly shared across Southeast Asia. And then finally, next slide, please. The last set of productions illustrate how in the Philippines, the staging of Shakespeare is always, in a sense, political. Not only is Shakespeare used to make sense of contemporary Philippine realities, it also draws from Philippine history in an effort to make Shakespeare particularly meaningful to Filipino audiences. It's some kind of, I guess, colonial hangover, and people still have some kind of have to assuage the guilt of staging a colonial playwright. So there's this push towards relevance and making it mean in Philippine history. So for example, here's something, this is from the 1990s, but it's a really interesting production of Taming of the Shrew. And it used the play as an allegory for the American colonization of the Philippines. So Petruchio was an invading American soldier who conquered Caterina, who is, adamantly, staunchly Filipino, and you see her in Filipina dress. And this kind of marriage, forced marriage, becomes an allegory for, the benevolent assimilation or the colonization of the Philippines by the Americans. Next slide, please. This one is the production of Titus Andronicus, where the violence, and we know Titus is a very violent play, the violence in Shakespeare's original play finds its analog in the contemporary Philippine election violence. So it does, to make Titus Andronicus mean in the Philippines, this adaptation sets it in a small town during election period, and suddenly the violence made sense. Which kind of is a weird idea if you're outside the Philippines, because Titus can be fairly violent. I mean, this is the play where he cuts up people, bakes them in a pie, and serves them to the mother who is the political enemy, etc. But if you this play came out, I think, was inspired by a massacre like 15 years ago as part of election violence, warring warlords in the Philippine South, where one candidate had the convoy of the wife of the opponent, a convoy that consisted of the wife, the kids, and 45 journalists just massacred and buried in a mass grave. I mean, that's how violent Philippine elections can be. So Titus Andronicus was a good play to sort of like, talk about that. Next slide, please. This one was a play that was put up after Typhoon Haiyan. If you remember that, Haiyan was then the biggest typhoon that ever hit the planet, and it devastated some of the islands in central Philippines, killing up to 10,000 people. So this was a sort of adaptation of The Tempest, where it was interwoven with the aftermath of that devastating typhoons, and there was a lot of climate change and the recent tragedy, etc., folded into the staging of The Tempest. And finally, last example, this is, next slide, please. RD3RD, which is Richard III, an adaptation of Shakespeare's play that relocates it from the story of the rise of a tyrant during the Wars of the Roses to the rise of Rodrigo Duterte, the Filipino tyrant, and his genocidal war on drugs. So this play focused a lot on the extrajudicial killings, on how people enable the rise of authoritarian rule. This was staged during the reign of Duterte. I must say that one of the major inspirations for this was Stephen Greenblatt's reading of The Rise of Donald Trump in the US. So this play might resonate for Americans today as well. So again, it's a very political take on Shakespeare and uses Shakespeare to explain contemporary politics in the Philippines. Anyway, these are only some examples of more recent work from the Philippines. There's more to be said, but I'll stop here. Maybe just pick up some of these points in the Q&A. Thank you.
All right. Great. Well, we are a little bit running late, so let's talk about ASA a little bit, and then also your upcoming conference. Just very quickly.
Okay, Asian Shakespeare Association. Why? Because like Judy is from the Philippines, studied in the US. I'm from Taiwan, studied in the US. And when we need to meet, we meet in Stratford. Even though Taiwan and Philippines are only like 2 hours away, by flight. And that doesn't make sense, right? And then also when I go to Japan, I'm going to Japan as a tourist. I mean, even though Taiwan's a small island, close to many countries, but I knew almost nothing about the Philippines. I never visited Malaysia or Indonesia. I always would go to the West. And then so the intercultural connection or communication is always between East and West. I believe that it is also true for Judy, who spent years in the US studying, right? So once I was attending the International Shakespeare Conference in Stratford, I'm like, we have to do something. We have to meet in Asia. So that's where how the ASA started, because we have to meet in Asia. And my former colleague Chen Guangxin said, Asia as method. So that's what we're doing, Asia as method, because Shakespeare is our common language. I mean, I wouldn't know anything about Filipino theater or Korean theater if not for Shakespeare. Through Shakespeare, we Asian peoples get to know each other, get a deeper understanding and communication and collaboration, as we're going to do. So 10 days from now, December 4th through 6th, we're doing our 6th conference in Iloilo in the Philippines. We've done that in Taipei, New Delhi, Manila, Seoul, and one online due to the pandemic. So this is our first time to meet in person after the pandemic. We're all very exciting. So yeah, maybe Judy can talk a little bit more about the conference, who is the local host.
Oh, well, we're hosting the 6th iteration of the Asian Shakespeare Association Conference in Iloilo, a UNESCO city of gastronomy, which will be reason enough for people to come. There's more information. I think I'll just post information on the conference. It's called Shakespeare Shorelines. So you can imagine there's a lot of island and beach involved, but we're really looking at sort of eco-critical Shakespeare, but also as Shakespeare as sort of the meeting point between land and sea and that sort of thing. But I think we'll just post the link to the conference if people are interested. You can still sign up. We'll gladly take you and welcome you in Iloilo in about 10 days. Thanks.
Wow. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I'm gonna move to the next section, and then so I wanna invite Julia and Eli. So the next section will be we have two wonderful moderators who are my colleagues. So UCI has a very vibrant Shakespeare culture. And so, such as we have the great Shakespeare scholar like Julia Lupton, Professor Julia Lupton, and then we have a great Shakespeare director like Professor Eli Simon. And we also have a great Shakespeare theater, the New Swan Theater, that we stage Shakespeare for 2 months, the entire summer, every day with 2 plays in rotation. So for those of you who are actually at UCI, if you haven't gone to one, I will say shame on you. You need to go because it's wonderful. So yeah, without further ado, I just want to have Professor Lupton and Simon, if you have any questions for them. And
Sure.
yeah.
First of all, thank you, Daphne, for organizing this. We've had Beatrice here in person, I think, before the pandemic, and we need to bring you back. I think there's really a hunger among our students and our larger community to learn more about these productions. The snippets that you gave us, I think we all just wanted to be immersed in that and learn more and be inspired and educated. There's so much in there that really fascinated me. I want to congratulate you on your co-edited book, Shakespeare's Asian Journeys, which takes up a lot of the issues that you discussed today in a more academic way. And one of the ideas that's in that book, Judy, is I'm not going to pronounce this right, archipelagic Shakespeare. So the idea of the Asian archipelago that connects Australia to Southeast Asia, being kind of less attention to what that part of Asia is contributing to this very vibrant and percolating creativity. And that also, I think, came up in what Beatrice was saying about the Asian Shakespeare Association being about getting a broader inter-Asian conversation going as well. I mean, that was just kind of mind-blowing to me. So I wonder whether, Judy, you could talk a little bit about archipelagic Shakespeare and the idea of the journey and the shoreline, which I think is so great because it's like coming out of Shakespeare, his own plays and sensibility, but then really being kind of remapped in this very contemporary way by the work of the Asian Shakespeare Association and creative people and scholarly people are doing in this part of the world.
Right. Thank you. Thank you, Julia. Yeah, I kind of offered the archipelago as an alternative paradigm to imagine global Shakespeares, because at the time people kept talking about global Shakespeares in terms of national Shakespeares. Chinese Shakespeare, Japanese Shakespeare, British Shakespeare, as if these were self-contained, monolithic kind of entities, easily separable one from the other. Okay. And I found that rather uncomfortable because, well, I guess it's also my lived experience. I come from an archipelago of over 7,000 islands, and I know that we speak like 89 major languages, and it's still all Filipino. I know that when I go from one island to another, the culture, the cuisine shifts. So it's a very so every time, I felt like such an imposter talking about Filipino Shakespeare because it's really much more diverse. And so sort of that kind of lived experience led me to thinking about an alternative paradigm to the globe, which all was too encompassing and too solid. Um, so I thought about how cultures crossed in maritime Southeast Asia. So I gave the example of Sintang Dalisay, which is a Filipino version of Shakespeare, but it uses a cultural form that is shared in Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia, and has traveled that way. And we have evidence of earlier forms of Shakespeare, like the Bangsawan Malay, Bangsawan theater, using Shakespearean forms and traveling again around maritime Southeast Asia. So instead of thinking of national borders as things that define Shakespeare, we might think of oceans. We might think of Shakespeare as the oceans that connect us all, and that we're islands, but there's point of contact all around the ocean that is Shakespeare. I mean, it's just playing with a different geographical paradigm to help understand Shakespeare, I think, a little better.
That's so wonderful. I'm
Yeah.
I'm just thrilled by this conversation and the videos and images that you've shared with us. It's beyond exciting. I was really taken by how youthful so many of these productions seemed, and it's something that we really grapple with here in America. I think at all of the Shakespeare festivals, we see our audiences aging, frankly. And I've really seen that to be true at New Swan as well. And we're always talking about how can we engender productions? How do we build our audiences of the future? It seems as though that is really happening with your theaters. And so I have a couple of questions related to that. Um, First of all, I guess, can you see that to be happening, that young people are excited by these productions and are getting exposed to Shakespeare in a way that makes them want to continue that journey? And is there a connection between these productions and the school system in Taiwan and the Philippines and elsewhere?
Okay, I will start. Thank you, Julia and Eli. I didn't have a chance to thank you, and Daphne. I was rushing to start. So yeah, I think in Taiwan, the theater audience, at least in metropolitan Taipei, the theater audience is largely young and female. So I don't know how unique that is, but I think it's very different from like the people I meet in an opera house in the West, where everyone wears, dress formal and have, salt and pepper hair. They are established enough to pay for the opera house subscription. But in Taiwan, I think theater is for the young people, and therefore I think it has a lot of, that's why theater companies feel free to like really do creative stuff and to break the traditions. I guess middle-aged Taiwanese people are all busy with making money and raising kids, so they don't go to the theater as much. So yeah, in Taiwan at least, the theater is mostly for younger people, like under 30. Yeah.
It's a similar situation in the Philippines, but only to add that the professional theater scene in the Philippines is not as robust as it would be. I mean, if you think West End or Broadway or maybe even Taiwan, but it also, people who go to theater very much consider academic theaters as part of the professional theater scene. That school productions, say from universities, the bigger, more well-known ones, are also seen as at par, if not better than professional theater companies. So these theater companies, the academic ones, produce more Shakespeare, more classics because they're part of universities, and so it gets more exposure. But sure, catering to youth culture is marketing, because because you do have captive audiences. People require their students to watch plays. Now, hopefully, we do those plays well enough so that they graduate into watching it when they grow up. Um, Maybe not quite as successful, which is why we have to reach into other forms like musicals, or maybe sort of make it controversial and politically, sort of dangerous, so people will flock to it because it might be censored at any time. So there are all kinds of marketing things we also consider. But yeah, it's really tied to the it's tied to schools still.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Very much.
I want to, can I add one thing? I think, for the non-English part of Asia, Shakespeare is not schoolwork. So we're not afraid of Shakespeare. We don't have that kind of resentment as English student may have. That's, oh, I've done that in middle school. I don't want to see another Shakespeare, not another Shakespeare. For us, it's just as entertaining as Hollywood movies. We don't have that burden.
I want to add one thing though. In the US, we don't have government subsidy for theater. So theater tickets are really expensive. So easily I saw a play at Gavin Playhouse, right? It's great, but it's more than $100. And that's not the cheapest ticket, right? So it's hard. It's hard for young people to see theater that much. Yeah, in the US. That's how I feel. Yeah. Can we just have one more question? I know we're at time, but this is so wonderful. I don't want to end it yet. Maybe one more
Do
question.
we have a question from the audience?
Oh, yeah, sure.
Absolutely. As you know, I always have questions. I hate to broach this question because it could be very painful, but I'm very curious. What do you see as the influence of China, that is mainland China, on Shakespeare in the close by areas, especially in Taiwan? Is Taiwan using Shakespeare as maybe a political statement sometimes?
Yeah, as I said, there are all kinds of Shakespeare in Taiwan, so there are commercial and political. But China and Taiwan are, even though people may not be aware of it, I often see it as one culture, at least the Shakespeare, because like the Shakespearean translations, like several of the very important translations we use today in Taiwan are from people based in China. So not a problem. They use simplified Chinese, we use traditional Chinese, but with one click, you can convert it on the computer, and most people can read both ways. And they have very interesting, very diverse Shakespeare, not just Chinese opera Shakespeare. They also have subversive Shakespeare. Like I saw a 12th Night in which, Marvolio was being teased by a bunch of red guards. So their Shakespeare can also be very interesting and very critical and even subversive. So I don't see that as a problem. Yeah, of course, there are Taiwanese Shakespeare that try to portray China as an enemy, but it's just part of the very diverse scene.
Okay. All right, maybe one more person from the audience. One more question from the audience.
Daihan, did you have a question?
No? And Julia or Eli, do you have one last question?
I mean, I was really interested in the comments at the beginning about the use of otherworldly and afterworldly cosmologies and traditions and merging those with Shakespeare. And I've read a little bit about that, but it's been kind of anecdotal, like this particular production. And so that was the first time I thought about that as actually kind of a consistent through line or feature of Asian adaptations. So I was wondering whether you just wanted to say a little bit more about that. I imagine that certain plays like Macbeth and Romeo and Juliet work especially well with that kind of treatment, but that really fascinated me in the way you connected that to intertextuality and afterlives of works. It was just, that was very engaging.
Yeah, a number of it's not all through Asia. Of course, I haven't seen all the productions throughout Asia, but a number of forms incorporate that. I mean, of course, the famous example would be Miyagi Satoshi's Mugen no Othello, where the whole story of Othello is told through the ghost of Desdemona. Or the other no Hamlet, where that begins with the line, I forget title now, but begins with the line, "To be or not to be is no longer the question." Because it's all about the ghost of Hamlet and Ophelia finding each other in the afterlife. When I saw that, that blew my mind too, because we always think of like to be or not to be. That is the question. Well, then here's a play that says it's no longer the question. It's about finding forgiveness in the afterlife. So there are a lot of traditions that do that. In the Romeo and Juliet, for example, Sintang Dalisay that I showed that uses the Southeast Asian form, it ends with Romeo and Juliet reuniting in death and sort of releasing butterflies, because butterflies are a symbol of, your spirit set free. So there's that whole realm of the afterworld, which is sort of exploited. Not that it doesn't exist, because Shakespeare has ghosts, but they're very real ghosts. They're still people. They're confined by the plot. In Asian theater, the ghosts become the plot. So to me, that becomes a very liberating realm in which to explore Shakespeare. And I think that's why I say these are the spaces, the affordances of working in Asian Shakespeare. You get to work in different sort of other possibles.
Well, I think you should write a book just about that.
Yeah, thank you so much today. Yeah, I learned so much. I was fortunate to see Sintan Dalisay in the Philippines, and I saw some of the Taiwanese Shakespeare's as well. Yeah, so it's such a great pleasure to have all of you here, and I wish we could be meeting in person. And yeah, and I wish I'm going to Iloilo. I wish I was going to Iloilo. Yeah. Okay, thank you so much today. Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. It was
Yeah.
really so inspiring.